Welcome to yet another episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast. As always, your host for this podcast is me, Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu. Thanks for listening in. I want to talk in this episode of the podcast about what to do. We're right smack in the middle of the autumn period, mid-April, mid-autumn. It's a matter of what do we do from here on out with the last half of this autumn period, and what we should be looking for, what you should have your mind set on it right at the moment. And I'm also going to talk about working on cedars. So that's something which is pretty common around now as we sort of head towards the cooler months. I find working on my cedars about now is really useful, and they're a lovely species. One of the best we have available for us as bonsai. Different colours, different varieties. They're just a magic tree when it comes to bonsai, and very classical. So I want to run through just a little bit of what I do with them as well. We've certainly passed the autumn equinox now. That happened, I Googled it, checked it was the 20th of March, basically meaning that on the 20th of March, the daylight hours and nighttime hours were the same. So heading to where we are now, nighttime hours are actually longer than daylight hours. So we're heading towards dormancy, heading towards the darkest day of the year, which is in sort of late June. But it means that our trees, being the clever little things that they are getting ready, are prepared, and you will have definitely noticed by now that there are changes afoot with what's being done. Your pines, the colour will be changing, like we talked about last time. We've been talking about fertilising your black pines previously. So it's a matter of, I suppose, being ready for what's coming next. And I find that if I can get my cedar working now, in this sort of the last couple of weeks of autumn, then it leaves me free that when May gets here and June, I can really focus on a lot of my pine work. So is it a touch early? Maybe not. I've worked on cedars a lot earlier than this, and they've been perfectly fine. Just got to be careful, but you got to be careful with all your trees. So I think that will be that'll be a full podcast. So let's get into it, eh? So mid-autumn, it's a great time to do a final check for any pruning work that needs to be done prior to dormancy, and specifically for trees which shouldn't be pruned once they are dormant, in my opinion. And I'll put a broad brush on this and say it's pretty much anything in my yard that's not a conifer. Conifers I don't mind working on in towards the winter months. I think they actually work really well during that period. They're very flexible, and I do the least damage when I'm bending and moving and whatever, and styling and shaping those varieties. So my preference is to get them done during the winter's months, but it means that anything that's not in that category, and normally I'd say deciduous I wouldn't be working on during dormancy, but I extend it a little bit wider. It helps me sleep at night, because I know that I don't have extra jobs that I have to be doing on different varieties. But if I get them all done nice and early, then I can rest easy. So for me, I really don't want to be doing anything work-wise on deciduous, or anything work-wise on my Australian natives. I like to have them done prior to winter. Can they be worked on in winter? Yeah, they can. But my preference is to get them out of the way, because I've got to focus on other varieties, other species. So if you don't have any pines to work on, and you've got natives and you want to work on them, then yeah, sure, go for it. But for me, it's not high on the priority list. The other thing, my evergreens, certain things like my olives, I try and get them done prior to the winter period. Can you still work on them? Yeah, you can, but like I said, I'll try and clear the decks before I get there. And if you're working on something like a Japanese maple, they are notorious for pushing out their buds at all the junctions, and that swelling and that knuckling of growth they get. So use this opportunity, post spring and summer growth, post early autumn growth. Use the opportunity to get in there and really remove anything where there's more than 2 bits of growth in any one area. This 1 to 2 becomes really important with your maples. It's so common for me to see a very full structure on maples, but the structure that I see isn't the best. And when it gets to winter, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll have lots of thick, coarse branches coming out of all different areas with no flow in the structure. So you want to use this opportunity now during this autumn period to get in there and really make sure that you're removing the foliage and the branches and the buds, everything that's sort of popping out of the one area. I worked on a big maple forest recently, and what looked like before we started working, a beautiful silhouette, looked lovely. By the time it was finished, it was that plucked chook, because when you go in there and you thoroughly remove the structure that's wrong, that's growing the wrong way, that's too thick, too coarse, the internode length is too long, you come back to the bare bones. And good structure is good bonsai. Rule number one for me: good structure is good bonsai. So at the expense of fullness, I will always come back to that view that if I improve the structure now, it might be a step backwards, but I'm going to take a million steps forward in the future on this tree by making some tough decisions now, or thorough decisions, being accurate with what I'm doing. So this mid-autumn period is a perfect time to be doing that sort of thing. And styling, a bit of light wiring and stuff like that right now is perfect. Tree's still in a healing phase, so if you do happen to crack them slightly, they'll heal before they get to the dormancy around the June period, the mid-year sort of range, when if you were doing the sort of styling work that I'm talking about, then I think you might have a few issues with regard to dieback on branches and frosty or cold weather getting in there and really affecting those areas of the tree. Another thing you've got to look out for at the moment is your watering. Your watering definitely will be changing, and it'll be becoming more tree to tree based, where we've got this, we're in a bit of a pickle. We've got this quandary, right, where we're using tea bags to fertilize our trees. To get the goodness from the tea bag into the soil for the tree to take up, we need to use water. Water's the conduit. It's what's forcing the nutrients out of the tea bag into the soil for then the root system to uptake. So if you're not watering, then your fertilizing isn't effective. But if the trees started to head toward dormancy early, and you're still plowing water on there, and the roots just physically can't take it up at the rate that they were, then you'll start inducing a rot environment where the tree then will start getting weaker as a result. So it's tough. We want as much water as possible because we want the fertilizer in there as much as we possibly can. But too much, we're going to start damaging the roots that we need to take up the fertilizer. So round and round we go on this merry-go-round of trees heading towards dormancy, which makes the watering really tough, really, really bloody tough. Spring, I've talked about this plenty of times before. You come into spring and it's sort of like err on the side of caution, start dumping the water on there because the trees will take it up sooner or later as they wake up. Summer, just flood the trees because they're going to take it. Autumn is really tough. Winter, it's winter, so you just don't want them to become bone dry, so you're watering infrequently, but you're still giving them enough that they're not going to kill, the roots aren't going to dry out and die excessively. They're not really taking the water up. There's very little foliage. There's no movement on growth rate on the tree. But during autumn, the trees are still doing stuff. Like they're still building their strength and resources. They're still pulling it all into their trunk so they can get through the dormancy period. But it's not as easy to see and it's not as obvious. So watering becomes really, really bloody tough at this time of the year. So don't be hard on yourself, but just keep an eye on it. Always revert back to the moisture meter. If in doubt, use a moisture meter and see. Wait until the tree starts to get onto the drier side, then top it back up again. It might be that you're watering, I don't know, once a day. It might be that you're watering once every day and a half. It could be on some days when you've got strong winds and maybe it's a bit drier than usual. We're heading towards what they predict to be a dry winter down here in Melbourne, that, maybe you're watering twice a day every now and then, and every other day it's once a day. Who knows? Like it's unique. It depends on what your microclimate is and the impact that that's going to have on you and your trees. And you just really need to be in tune with your trees and what they need. And watering is one of those ones you've got to be really, really super careful of and super mindful that it's not easy. It's bloody tough. don't just run watering systems flat out all day, every day, because that's not going to do any favours for you or for your trees. Another thing to look out for at the moment that I find really common is pest scale start to appear as those leaves start to fall from the trees. Anything that's slightly on the weakened side, you'll start seeing scale around the trees. Have a look under the branches. Hunt, and possums become an absolute nightmare about now because foliage is starting to fall from the trees, so their food source naturally is starting to diminish. And I can tell you that your beautiful looking cedars, they start to become on the dinner menu for these aggressive feeders that are just monsters around the yard. So I try and move my trees away from fences. Try and do whatever you can. It's really difficult to control them. So just be mindful that they are painful. I've tried all the keep off sprays. It just doesn't seem to work. I've tried even spraying very little foliage with say my rose shield or something like that to make what's left of the foliage taste terrible. But when they get desperate, they will literally eat an old shoe. They are very persistent, and you've just got to be mindful that do what you can. But isolation of the trees. I find trees that are on podiums are definitely better than trees that are on benches, and any benches that are near a fence line or other overhanging trees are just fair game. And every year I seem to go through, and people I speak to seem to go through exactly the same phase. The other thing that I really think is a good time now, as you're focusing a lot on your watering, you should have done your second fertilise by now of all your trees. The other thing that I look for is to start flagging trees that need to be repotted. Things that feel like bricks, things maybe that you think aren't doing quite so well or maybe haven't fared so well through the summer period. Just start making a list. Start, putting a flag into those trees, a tag with repot written on it, or, a bit of wire that hangs off the primary branch with a bread tie on it or whatever. I don't care what the system is, but it's worthwhile looking at them now because if they're staying too wet, if they're too dry and just cannot seem to get the water in them, if the soil feels like it's as hard as concrete, if there looks like there's a bit of dieback on the trees, if they're too soggy, things just haven't been right. Like maybe you haven't had a great growing season of spring and they're just really struggling, and you'll know which ones they are. Then flag them now. Get onto it right now so you can make sure that when it does get to repotting time, you've got enough supplies in your kit that, don't be surprised when you start repotting. Don't just randomly walk around your yard and go, oh, that could do with it, that could do with it. Yeah, that one over there, that could have a crack as well. And suddenly go, well, I've bought 3 bags of potting mix. I've got enough trees here for about 10 bags of potting mix. Which ones are you going to do? Or do you suddenly miss the window of opportunity because you've left repotting to the last minute? I always err on the side of caution. Always make sure that you're on the front foot with this stuff and make sure that you're ready to go. So this mid-autumn period, there's not a lot of work to be done. You're starting to there's a bit of a lull in the situation. That is until I get to the next section of the podcast. But there's a bit of a lull, I find, so you can draw a breath and you can plan and get ready for the next phase if you're not already ready for it. And just be mindful that it's going to come around bloody fast. So get on it. Don't take this the wrong way. But if black pines are the king of the bonsai, then I think cedars are the prince. Don't go turning the podcast off and throwing dirt at it, because I love all bonsai. I love Australian natives. I love everything. I'm not going to go through and caveat it. But if what I'm getting to, I suppose, is that in my mind, I have a very high opinion of cedars and the quality and how they are represented as classical bonsai in what I believe to be a very classical sense, in that very Japanese feel. And yeah, I know, whatever. Natives, we've got our own thing going on in Australia and everyone does all around the world, and that's cool. But hey, my podcast, my opinion, I reckon that they're an absolute ripping tree. I feel I feel for those different states around the country that maybe can't grow them quite as well. In Australia, in Melbourne, in Victoria, we've got nice cool climate. We've got nice summer. We've got a good mix between the two. We get extremes, but it doesn't get super freezing. It does get bloody hot here, but we get a good range of both. So I find that cedars grow particularly well in my climate where I am, and for that reason, I see a hell of a lot of them. And this time of the year for me is really one of the prime cedar work times for me, for the maintenance, for the styling, for really getting in there and doing what needs to be done. So I thought it'd be a useful section on the podcast to just talk about them and to maybe give you a few tips if you do have cedars and maybe you're looking at how to lift them to the next level. There could be a few things in this part of the podcast which might just sort of help you right at this time of the year. So from the spring period, you've probably given them a haircut already, and then summer's come around and autumn, and they've pushed out. There seems to be a second flush with these things. It's more not that I really think that there's a second flush with cedars, but there's sort of like a continual flush. So one bud will start to grow, and then you'll cut that off. The new buds that form there don't start to push, so you don't get a second push from those. But another bud that's an older bud that was maybe laying dormant somewhere on the branch, suddenly once you've cut that extension originally, another extension starts to appear. So you end up with what you think is this, oh my God, these things never stop growing. It's not really. It's hormonal. It's auxin. You remove auxin from the tip of a growing shoot at one point. Then it frees up the other buds that are further back along the branch or in different places on the branch to get their chance to start to grow. So when it comes to working at this time of the year, there'll be a range of different things that you've got to do. But one of the things that I really like to do at this point in time is to reduce the extensions. That is based on the fact that you're not running sacrifice branches. If you're running sacrifice branches, then by all means, leave that shoot long. But if you've got multiple shoots coming off a sacrifice branch, pick one, pick the strongest one, cut all the others off so all the resources then go just to that strong one, because sacrifice branch length comes from one tip growing, not from multiple tips growing. So normally if you're working on a tree that you're really trying to get the quality and the styling up to a really, really nice high level, a sharp level, then you'd be working at the moment at reducing those extensions. You may take them also and wire them so they start to form directional parts of the branches, but you're doing something with them. You're just not leaving them alone to stick up out of the middle of nowhere. So one of the things that I work on is the extensions. The second thing I'm going to work on, yep, you guessed it, unders. Any needles that are coming from underneath the branch are plucked. Any buds that are growing underneath those branches, they're pruned, they're cut off as well. It's just an absolute waste to be having anything growing underneath foliage pads, because it's taking resources and it's going to be removed anyway, or it's going to die because it's not going to get enough sunlight. So it has to be removed. But I want to talk about a concept, bullnosing on the pads. I believe I've talked about this before on the podcast, but when you're working on your cedars, you really want when I work on my cedars, my preference is to have a very sharp edge going up and out on my pads. All right, so if you look at one of your cedar pads before you start the work, you'll see it looks like it's bullnose. It goes very rounded on the outside edge because as it gets the sunlight on the side of the pads, those buds then start to grow, and as those needles push out, they go out in a radial fashion, which means folding around and going underneath or to the very, very bottom of the pad as well. It gives a real bullnose effect on the branch, and it makes it look very soft and maybe not quite as crisp as what I like. So one of the things that I work on when I'm pruning unders is also to start working on bullnosing. So as I've cleaned the needles underneath, I've cut the extensions on top. I've worked out either they're staying and being wired into the pads, or they're being used as sacrifices, or they're being cut off. And pruning back the extensions can be done to leave a bud behind where the extension is pruned, or if you don't have any, which is very unusual, if you don't have any buds behind it, cut into the new extension. That way you've got the best chance ever of getting back budding happening prior to the cut. So that's the proviso with cutting extensions. Either a bud's there or you're cutting into the new section that's grown, because then you'll get a chance of back budding happening in that area on the branch. Always happens. I'd say 99%, I might say 95%, but for me, it's almost pretty much every time I cut like that, I get back budding happen on strong, healthy cedars. So once I've done the unders and the extensions, then I start working on this bullnosing. I start looking at the pads from the side view, like looking at them smack on from the side. And if I can't see needles going up, if I see needles either coming out on the horizontal or below the horizontal, then I look back to the center and see where that bud is and think, can I prune that bud off? Because if that's gone, the bud that's beside it should have its needles coming up and out. So then I start getting that crisp edge on my pads. So by the time I've got it nice and clean underneath, I've got nice doming on top with my pruning, not a flattened structure. When you start then cleaning out the bullnosing on the edge of the pads, you start to really take shape as to how good this suit is going to look when this work's finished. And it happens really quick. Spending 5 minutes going around each pad doing that bullnosing, you'll suddenly realize a massive difference. And you have to be confident when you're doing it, because you are pruning off these beautiful little buds. You are, making some decisions. But once you start and you start to see the effect of the buds that are left to the inner side, one bud inner to the edge of the pad, and then you can pluck the outside rim of those, like the circular rim of those needles as well, for the bud that's remaining, you'll find that you get a very crisp edge on the pad. So then the last thing to look at is how dense these pads get. Like, they get so full of needles and growth that, spiders love getting in there, spider mites love getting in there. You start getting dieback in those inner areas, and it's just a nightmare, to be honest. So one of the things you have to do when you have cedars is a lot of plucking of old needles. The older needles will always have, no matter which shade of cedar that you have, the older needles will have a different color. They'll be maybe a darker olive green. They might be a pastier, whiter color as opposed to the blue new needles on a blue Atlantic cedar. They'll look different, and they're always further away from the center bud. So if you're not sure which are the old needles before you start plucking, you never want to remove the new needles, or remove minimal of the new needles, because the needles only last a couple of years and then they're gone. So if you pluck out new needles and leave old needles, then unfortunately you're going to weaken the tree and possibly have some dieback on there. So go to the center of the new bud. The needles closest to that bud are the newer needles. Leave those alone. Keep working your way further back along that little branch that you've got, or little branchlet, or whatever it is. And then just below those new needles, you'll see there's a change in color. They're the old needles. That's where that bud existed prior to spring coming around. And then it's pushed up and these new needles will come out, and there's a new bud that's formed in the center as well to continue the growth. So you want to get in there and see if you can pluck out the vast majority of those old needles that are back in further. Do not use your fingers. You will do more damage than good by using your fingers. So get in there with some good tweezers. I always use my pine tweezers. Get in there and pluck in the direction that the needles are growing. It is a slow, I'm rubbing my forehead as I say this, it is a slow, laborious job, but it is so fulfilling. Like your tree, with the cleaning that you've done, you've neatened up the edges. The last part is to get in there and make sure sunlight and air can get in there, so you don't get fungal issues, so you don't get diebacks, you don't get spiders in there, you don't get bits of your tree that die that you don't want to die, and you get some sunlight and air in there. You may run the joyful reason of back budding happening in those areas. So you need to make sure that you're only plucking the older needles towards the newer needles and getting them nice and open. You can, once you've done all that work, then and only then do you get in and do the wiring. If you are putting wire on your tree before you've done that clean out, then you're going to be going across old needles, and I guarantee you will be making an absolute mess of it. You'll be snapped. They're very delicate. The small little branches don't take much to be knocked off when you're clumsy putting your hands through there with wire. So my preference is to always clean everything, get it looking magnificent, then come in and start doing the wiring. I hold primary wire. I might do some secondary wiring, but that's it. Don't go to the nth degree, because you'll break things, you'll snap them, you'll end up with dead parts on your tree. So I'd be really careful when you're shaping, but only do the shaping and clean up after you've done the cleanup on the tree. Focus on, when you're wiring and shaping, this applies to every tree that you've got. Focus on the flow and movement of the tree. Trunk line movement, apex, pruning, positioning with wire to make sure it's flowing towards the directional side of the tree. Your key branch is heading in the right direction. Don't have a counterbalance branch which is fighting the flow of the tree. A compression side, an extension side, and just try and get that feel and flow of the tree. It's hard to talk about on a podcast, but it's the last thing that I really want to talk about when I'm working on my Cedars, because they do really lend themselves to that classical shape. They take on so many forms, from full cascade right the way through to literati. They do everything: formal uprights, informal uprights, slanting, not windswept, but wind affected, definitely. They're a very versatile tree that over time you want to avoid scarring on the trunks. Absolute bloody nightmare. Once you've got scarring on the trunk, it's very hard to get rid of it. But the bark, once it starts to catch up with the age, I've never found the grafts that they have to be an issue. So they're really a tree to invest time into, and just take the time to really make sure that they're spot on, because I don't work on them a lot. I think, maybe there's 2 times a year that I'd really work on my cedars, because I do like to let them grow and extend and push these shoots out and then come back in, because they're increasing their strength. If they're always looking perfect and they're always plucked within an inch of their lives and they look like a statue, then I find that they can get a little bit too weak for me. So I try and make sure that I'm absolutely thorough when I do it. Use the right tools at the right time, and you'll get the right results. And this is the time for your cedars. So if you've got them, get into it. Well, that's it, bonsai lovers. Thank you very much for listening in. It's been my absolute pleasure to present and offer this podcast to the bonsai world. And I love the feedback. I love the enthusiasm, and I love that it might be that a little piece of the puzzle in what you do. I claim zero credit for what you achieve in your bonsai life, but it does make me feel fantastic that at times. Sometimes it's just to help you get to sleep at night that you listen to this podcast, but it provides some kind of content in a content crazy world that we live in, and I honestly appreciate and cherish that you give me your time, and it's the most important bloody thing that you have. So thank you very much. I love you all. I love your trees. I love what you put into them, and as always, next week I'll be back. Happy bonsai.